The blood on her brother's knuckles was still fresh when Marlowe Graham learned she had been sold like livestock to pay off his poker debts. She stood in the cramped parlor of their weathered ranch house outside Calico, California, watching Thomas pace the warped floorboards with the frantic energy of a cornered animal, and felt the floor drop out from beneath her entire world. "You cannot be serious," Marlowe whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind rattling the loose window panes. It was late spring in 1882, and the afternoon sun beat mercilessly through the thin curtains, casting harsh shadows across Thomas's face. At 23, she had already buried both parents and worked her fingers raw trying to keep their small cattle ranch afloat, while her older brother squandered every spare dollar at the card tables in town. Thomas would not meet her eyes. "Victor Harding owns the deed to this place now, Marlowe. He owns everything. The only way out is if you marry him. He has agreed to forgive the debt if you become his wife." Marlowe's stomach turned. She had seen Victor Harding around Calico, a bloated man in his late 50s with yellowed teeth and hands that lingered too long when he touched the saloon girls. He ran most of the gambling operations in town and had a reputation for cruelty that extended far beyond the card tables. 2 of his previous wives had died under mysterious circumstances, and the law had never bothered to investigate. "I will not do it," Marlowe said firmly, though her hands trembled. "I will find work. I will pay off your debt myself." Thomas finally looked at her, and she saw something ugly in his expression, something desperate and mean. "The debt is $8,000, Marlowe. You could scrub floors for 100 years and never earn that much. Harding wants an answer by tomorrow night, or he sends his men to collect." "You know what that means." She did know. Everyone in San Bernardino County knew what it meant when Victor Harding sent his men to collect. People ended up beaten, their homes burned, their livestock slaughtered. Sometimes they simply disappeared into the vast Mojave Desert and were never seen again. Marlowe spent that night sitting on the porch, watching the stars wheel overhead and wondering how her life had come to this. Her mother had died of consumption 3 years ago, her father thrown from a horse 6 months later. She had believed Thomas would rise to the responsibility of running the ranch, but instead he had sunk deeper into gambling and drink. Now she was paying the price for his weakness. As dawn broke over the dusty hills, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold, Marlowe made a decision. She would ride into Calico and confront Victor Harding herself. Perhaps she could negotiate different terms, convince him to accept payment in installments, anything but marriage to that vile man. She saddled her mare, a sweet-tempered bay named Clementine, and made the 6-mile ride into town as the morning heat began to build. Calico was a silver mining town that had boomed in recent years, drawing prospectors and opportunists from across the country. The main street was lined with rough wooden buildings, their false fronts attempting to give an impression of permanence to what everyone knew was a temporary settlement that would vanish when the silver ran out. The Silver Spur Saloon, where Harding conducted most of his business, sat at the center of town. Marlowe tied Clementine to the hitching post and pushed through the swinging doors, her heart hammering against her ribs. The saloon was nearly empty at this early hour, just a few bleary-eyed miners nursing coffee and whiskey. Victor Harding sat at his usual table in the back corner, playing solitaire with a deck of cards, so worn the faces were barely visible. He looked up as Marlowe approached, and his lips curved into a smile that made her skin crawl. "Miss Graham," he said, his voice thick as molasses. "I had hoped you would come to see me. Saves me the trouble of sending for you." "I am here to discuss my brother's debt," Marlowe said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Surely we can reach some other arrangement besides marriage. Harding leaned back in his chair, his bulk straining the wood. "Your brother signed a contract, Miss Graham. When he could not pay, he offered you as collateral. That makes you my property now, unless the debt is paid in full by sundown tomorrow." "I am not property," Marlowe said through gritted teeth. "I am a human being with rights under the law." Harding laughed, a wet sound that made several of the miners glance over. "The law in Calico is what I say it is, girl. Sheriff Parker knows better than to cross me. Now you can marry me and live in comfort, or I can sell you to one of the mining camps up in the hills. Those boys have not seen a woman in months. Which would you prefer?" Before Marlowe could respond, the saloon doors swung open again, and a tall figure stepped into the dim interior. The man wore dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous places, and Marlowe noticed he wore a revolver on his right hip, the holster tied down in the manner of someone who knew how to use it. "I hear you are looking for someone to pay off an $8,000 debt," the stranger said, his voice a low drawl that carried clearly through the room. "I am here to settle it." Harding's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" The stranger removed his hat, revealing dark hair and piercing gray eyes and a face weathered by sun and wind. He looked to be in his late 20s, lean and hard in the way of men who lived rough. "Name is Zachary Xanders. I just sold my cattle herd up in Sacramento for a fair price, and I heard about Miss Graham's situation. I am willing to pay her brother's debt in full." Marlowe stared at the stranger in shock. Why would a complete stranger offer to pay such an enormous sum for someone he had never met? It made no sense, and yet here he stood, waiting for Harding's response. Harding's face had gone purple. "That debt is a private matter between me and Thomas Graham. It has nothing to do with you, Cowboy." Zachary Xanders stepped closer to Harding's table, and something in his movements made the fat man shrink back slightly. "The way I understand it, you have a legal contract stating the debt must be paid in full by tomorrow at sundown. I am offering to pay it. Unless you would rather explain to the territorial governor why you are forcing an unwilling woman into marriage, which I believe constitutes human trafficking under California law." The saloon had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now, sensing the confrontation brewing between the stranger and the most powerful man in Calico. Harding glared at Zachary for a long moment, then looked past him to Marlowe. She could see the calculation in his piggy eyes, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine. $8,000 in gold or silver coin paid by sundown tomorrow, and the debt is cleared. But if you default, Cowboy, Miss Graham becomes my property and you become my enemy. Do you understand?" "Perfectly," Zachary said. "I will be back before sundown with the full amount. In the meantime, Miss Graham is under my protection. If anything happens to her or her brother, our deal is off, and I will make sure every lawman between here and San Francisco knows about your human trafficking operation." He turned to Marlowe and offered his arm. "Miss Graham, may I escort you outside?" Still stunned, Marlowe took his arm and let him guide her out of the saloon into the bright morning sunlight. She blinked, trying to process what had just happened. "Why did you do that?" she asked once they were safely away from the saloon. "You do not even know me." Zachary replaced his hat and studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. "I knew your father," he said quietly. "John Graham. He helped me out of a bad situation about 5 years ago when I first came to California. I was 17, alone and about to make some very stupid choices. Your father gave me work on his ranch, taught me about cattle and horses, and treated me with more kindness than I had any right to expect. When I heard what your brother had done to you, I knew I had to help." It is what your father would have wanted. Tears stung Marlowe's eyes. She remembered that summer now, the quiet young man who had worked in their barn and helped with the branding. He had disappeared after a few months, and her father had said only that Zachary had gone north to make his fortune. "You are that boy," she whispered. "The one who used to sleep in the hayloft." A faint smile crossed Zachary's face. "I am surprised you remember. You were just 18 then, and I tried to stay out of sight most of the time. I was not fit company for a respectable rancher's daughter." "You have changed," Marlowe said, studying him more closely. The boy she barely remembered had been thin and uncertain. This man was confident and capable, with an edge of danger that made even Victor Harding think twice about crossing him. "5 years is a long time," Zachary said. "I went north, worked as a ranch hand, saved every penny, and finally scraped together enough to buy my own small herd. I have been driving cattle between Sacramento and Los Angeles, building up my stake. I was passing through Calico on my way south when I heard about your situation in the general store. And you just decided to pay $8,000 for a stranger." Marlowe shook her head. "That is your entire fortune, is it not? Everything you have worked for these past 5 years. Zachary met her gaze steadily. "Your father saved my life, Miss Graham. This is the least I can do to repay that debt. Besides, I cannot stand by and watch a good woman be forced into marriage with a man like Victor Harding. No amount of money is worth that." Marlowe felt something shift in her chest, a warmth spreading through her despite the morning heat. This man had just sacrificed everything he owned to save her from a terrible fate, asking nothing in return. It was the most selfless act she had ever witnessed. "I will find a way to pay you back," she said firmly. "Every penny. I do not care how long it takes." "We can discuss that later," Zachary said. "Right now, I need to wire my bank in Sacramento and arrange for the funds to be transferred to the Wells Fargo office here in Calico. That will take most of the day. In the meantime, I want you to stay somewhere safe. Do you have friends in town who can take you in?" Marlowe thought of the Hendersons, who ran the dry goods store. Mrs. Henderson had been friends with her mother, and she had always been kind to Marlowe. "Yes, I can stay with the Hendersons, but what about Thomas? Harding might go after him out of spite." "Your brother made his own choices," Zachary said, his voice hardening slightly. "But I will ride out to your ranch and make sure he understands the situation. If he has any sense at all, he will lay low until this is settled." They walked together to the general store, where Mrs. Henderson immediately agreed to let Marlowe stay in their spare room. The older woman fussed over Marlowe, bringing her tea and fresh bread, while Mr. Henderson and Zachary spoke in low tones near the front counter. As the day wore on, word spread through Calico about what had happened at the Silver Spur. People whispered about the mysterious cowboy who had challenged Victor Harding and offered to pay off the Graham debt. Some said Zachary was a gunfighter, others that he was a wealthy rancher's son in disguise. The truth, Marlowe knew, was both simpler and more impressive. He was just a man who had worked hard and was willing to sacrifice everything for the right cause. By late afternoon, Zachary returned to the general store with a leather satchel that clinked heavily when he set it on the counter. $8,000 in gold and silver coin, he said quietly. "I need witnesses when I pay it to Harding." Mr. Henderson nodded gravely. "I will come with you. So will Doc Patterson and Reverend Mills. Harding will not dare try anything underhanded with half the town watching." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a small crowd gathered outside the Silver Spur saloon. Marlowe stood near the back, her heart in her throat as she watched Zachary stride through the doors with Mr. Henderson, the doctor, and the Reverend flanking him. Inside, Victor Harding sat at his usual table, surrounded by his men. His face was impassive as Zachary approached, but Marlowe could see the anger burning in his eyes. He had wanted her as his prize, and now he was being forced to accept money instead. $8,000, Zachary said, appending the satchel on the table. Coins spilled across the surface, glinting in the lamplight. "Count it if you want. It is all there." Harding gestured to one of his men, who began counting the coins methodically. The process took nearly half an hour, during which nobody spoke. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the man looked up and nodded to Harding. $8,000 exactly, boss." Harding pulled out a folded paper from his vest pocket, the contract that bound Thomas Graham to his debt. He held it up so everyone could see, then slowly tore it in half. "The debt is paid," he said flatly. "Miss Graham is free to go." A collective exhale went through the room. Zachary gathered up the pieces of the contract, folded them carefully, and tucked them into his own pocket. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said, though his tone suggested anything but. Outside, the small crowd erupted in cheers. Marlowe found herself surrounded by well-wishers, people congratulating her on her freedom and marveling at Zachary's generosity. Through it all, she kept her eyes on the tall cowboy who had saved her, wondering what kind of man would do such a thing. As the crowd dispersed and darkness fell over Calico, Zachary finally made his way to Marlowe's side. "It is done," he said simply. "You are free." "Thank you," Marlowe said, and the words felt woefully inadequate for what he had done. "I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not owe me anything," Zachary said. "I told you this is about settling my debt to your father." "But where will you go now?" Marlowe asked, suddenly realizing that Zachary had given up everything. "You spent all your money. You have no herd to drive, no stake for a new start." Zachary shrugged, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I will figure something out. I always do. Maybe I will hire on as a ranch hand somewhere, start building up my savings again." An idea had been forming in Marlowe's mind ever since that morning, growing stronger with each passing hour. It was bold, possibly even scandalous, but she could not shake the feeling that it was right. "Come back to our ranch," she said impulsively. "Thomas has proven he cannot manage it properly, and I need help. You know cattle and horses. You could work for me, and I will split the profits with you fairly. It is not much, but it is a start." Zachary studied her in the dim light spilling from the saloon windows. "That is generous of you, Miss Graham, but people will talk. An unmarried woman living on a ranch with an unmarried man, even if your brother is there too." "Let them talk," Marlowe said fiercely. "You just saved me from a fate worse than death. I care more about doing what is right than what people think." A slow smile spread across Zachary's face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger and less guarded. "Then I accept your offer, Miss Graham. I would be honored to work for you." They shook hands formally, and Marlowe felt a spark jump between them at the contact. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing in the darkness. What was wrong with her? This man had saved her out of honor and duty, not because he had any romantic interest in her. She needed to remember that. The next morning, Marlowe and Zachary rode back to the Graham ranch together. Clementine and Zachary's buckskin gelding, a sturdy animal he called Dusty, moved side by side through the desert landscape. The sun was already fierce despite the early hour, and heat waves shimmered above the scrub brush and red rocks. "I should warn you," Marlowe said as they approached the ranch house. "Thomas might not be happy about this arrangement. He still thinks of himself as the head of the family." "Thomas lost the right to call himself head of anything when he gambled away your freedom," Zachary said bluntly. "If he gives you any trouble, he will answer to me." Sure enough, Thomas was waiting on the porch when they rode up, his face dark with anger. "What is he doing here?" he demanded, pointing at Zachary. "Zachary paid your debt," Marlowe said coldly, dismounting from Clementine. $8,000 that you threw away at the card tables. He saved my life, and now he is going to help me run this ranch properly. You can either accept that and stay, or you can leave. Those are your only choices." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "This is my ranch. Father left it to me." "Father left it to both of us," Marlowe corrected, "and you nearly lost everything. From now on, I make the decisions about how this place is run. If you want to stay, you follow my rules. No more gambling. No more drinking away our profits. You work the ranch alongside Zachary and me, or you get out." For a moment, Marlowe thought Thomas might actually strike her. But then he saw Zachary step up beside her, one hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip, and something in the cowboy's eyes made Thomas back down. "Fine," Thomas muttered. "I will work the ranch, but I do not have to like it." He stalked into the house, slamming the door behind him. Marlowe let out a shaky breath, surprised by her own boldness. She had never stood up to Thomas like that before, but something about having Zachary beside her gave her courage. "That went better than expected," Zachary observed mildly. Marlowe laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "If that is what better looks like, I would hate to see worse." Over the following weeks, a new rhythm established itself at the Graham ranch. Zachary proved to be everything Marlowe had hoped for and more. He worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences, treating sick cattle, breaking horses, and doing all the heavy labor that had fallen into neglect during Thomas's gambling spree. He was patient with the animals, skilled with his hands, and seemingly tireless in his efforts. Thomas kept to himself mostly, doing the bare minimum required of him and speaking to neither Marlowe nor Zachary unless absolutely necessary. Marlowe could not find it in herself to care. Her brother had betrayed her in the worst possible way, and it would take a long time before she could forgive him, if she ever could. What surprised Marlowe most was how much she enjoyed working alongside Zachary. They would ride out together to check on the cattle scattered across their grazing land, and during those long rides, they talked about everything under the sun. Zachary told her about his childhood in Texas, how his parents had died of yellow fever when he was 15, and how he had drifted west looking for a fresh start. Marlowe shared her own grief over losing her parents, her fears about the future, and her dreams of building the ranch into something her father would have been proud of. One evening in early summer, about 6 weeks after Zachary had paid off the debt, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the desert hills. The air was finally cooling after another scorching day, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and dust. "I have been thinking," Zachary said, his voice quiet in the gathering dusk, "about payment for the debt." Marlowe's stomach clenched. They had not discussed money since that first day, and she had been dreading this conversation. "I know I owe you $8,000, she said. "I have been keeping accounts, and if we have a good year, I should be able to start making payments by next spring." "That is not what I meant," Zachary interrupted. "I do not want your money, Marlowe." She turned to look at him, surprised by his use of her first name. He had been scrupulously proper up until now, always calling her Miss Graham. "Then what do you want?" Zachary was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "These past weeks, working beside you, getting to know you, have been some of the best of my life. You are strong and brave and kind, everything I could ever hope for in a woman. I know I have no right to ask this, but I am asking anyway. Would you consider courting me, Marlowe? Really courting me, with the intention of marriage if things go well between us?" Marlowe's heart began to race. She had been fighting her growing feelings for Zachary, telling herself it was inappropriate to develop romantic feelings for someone who had helped her out of obligation. But hearing him speak so openly, she realized he felt the same way she did. "I thought you paid the debt out of honor," she whispered, "because of what my father did for you." "I did," Zachary said, "but that is not the only reason I stayed. I could have moved on after paying Harding, found work somewhere else. I stayed because from the moment I saw you standing up to that man in the saloon, I was drawn to you. You have courage and integrity that most people lack. I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Marlowe felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will court you, Zachary, because I have been falling in love with you a little more each day, and I was terrified you did not feel the same way." Zachary reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. "I feel the same way," he said. "I have for weeks now." They sat like that as the stars began to appear overhead, holding hands and talking quietly about their hopes for the future. It was not a grand romantic gesture, no passionate declarations or dramatic kisses, but it felt right to Marlowe. This was the beginning of something real and lasting, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Over the following months, their relationship deepened. They continued to work the ranch together during the day, but now their evenings were spent in each other's company, talking and laughing and slowly learning everything about one another. Zachary was unfailingly patient and respectful, never pushing for more than Marlowe was ready to give. Thomas watched their growing romance with barely concealed resentment, but he kept his opinions to himself. Marlowe suspected he knew that if he caused trouble, Zachary would throw him off the ranch without hesitation. By autumn, when the desert heat finally broke and the nights turned cool, Zachary officially proposed. He did it simply, with no fancy ring or elaborate plans. They were riding back from checking on the herd when he reined in Dusty and turned to face her. "Marlowe Graham," he said, his gray eyes serious. "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You make every day brighter just by being in it. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Marlowe did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I will marry you, Zachary Xanders." He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, a gentle press of lips that promised everything she had ever dreamed of. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling so widely their faces hurt. They were married in late October in a simple ceremony at the small church in Calico. Mrs. Henderson stood as Marlowe's witness, and Mr. Henderson stood for Zachary. Thomas did not attend, claiming he had work to do at the ranch, but Marlowe found she did not care. This day was about her future with Zachary, not about her disappointing past with her brother. After the ceremony, they held a small reception at the ranch. Many of their neighbors came, bringing food and gifts and well wishes. Even some of the miners from Calico made the trip, curious to see the woman who had been saved from Victor Harding and the cowboy who had sacrificed everything to free her. That night, in the room that had been Marlowe's since childhood but was now theirs together, Zachary held her close and whispered words of love against her hair. "I promise to spend every day of the rest of my life making you happy," he said. "You are my everything, Marlowe." "And you are mine," she whispered back. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me." "Always," Zachary promised. "Always." Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. The ranch demanded constant work, and money was tight as they slowly paid down the remaining debts and invested in improving their herd. Thomas continued to be a source of tension, his presence a constant reminder of how close Marlowe had come to a terrible fate. But through it all, Marlowe and Zachary stood together, their love growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame. One spring morning, about 14 months after their wedding, Marlowe woke feeling nauseated. At first, she thought it might be something she had eaten, but when the nausea continued for several days, she began to suspect the truth. A visit to Doc Patterson in Calico confirmed it. She was pregnant. Zachary's face when she told him was something Marlowe would treasure forever. Pure joy blazed across his features, followed quickly by concern. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately. "Is the baby all right? What do you need?" Marlowe laughed, touched by his instant protectiveness. "I am fine," she assured him. "Doc says everything looks good." "We are going to have a baby, Zachary." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her chest. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby, I cannot believe it." "Believe it," Marlowe said, happiness flooding through her. "You are going to be a father." Zachary insisted on doing most of the heavy ranch work himself as Marlowe's pregnancy progressed, refusing to let her overexert herself. She protested at first, not wanting to be treated like fragile glass, but eventually she accepted his care as the expression of love it was. Their son was born on a cold December night in 1883, with Mrs. Henderson and Doc Patterson in attendance. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Marlowe feared she might not survive it. But finally, just after midnight, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "A boy," Doc Patterson announced, placing the squalling infant in Marlowe's arms. "A healthy baby boy." Zachary, who had been pacing anxiously in the other room, rushed in the moment he was allowed. He stared down at his son with wonder on his face, reaching out one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant immediately grasped it, and Zachary's eyes filled with tears. "He is perfect," Zachary whispered. "What should we name him?" "John," Marlowe said without hesitation, "after my father. Your middle name can be whatever you choose." "John William Xanders," Zachary said, testing the name. "After your father and mine, if that is all right with you." "It is perfect," Marlowe agreed, gazing down at her son's red, wrinkled face. "Welcome to the world, John William." As their son grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive under Zachary and Marlowe's joint management. They expanded their herd, improved their grazing land, and even hired a couple of hands to help with the work. Thomas remained on the ranch, but he was like a ghost, doing his assigned work but rarely interacting with anyone. Marlowe had long since given up hope that her brother would ever truly change. When John was 3 years old, Marlowe became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Rose, after Marlowe's mother. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and from the moment she was born, she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny finger. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered, the children grew, and Marlowe's love for Zachary deepened with each passing year. He was everything she could have asked for in a husband: hardworking, devoted, patient, and endlessly loving. Every day, she thanked whatever fate had brought him back into her life at precisely the moment she needed him most. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Zachary surprised her with a gift. He led her out behind the barn to where a new structure had been built, hidden from view of the main house. It was a small workshop, with wide windows to let in the light and sturdy workbenches lining the walls. "I know you have always wanted to try your hand at leatherworking," Zachary said, watching her face anxiously. "I thought you could use this space to make saddles, bridles, whatever you wanted. The children are getting older and do not need as much constant attention. This could be something just for you." Marlowe walked through the workshop, running her hands over the smooth wood and the tools Zachary had carefully arranged. She was overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness, by the fact that he had noticed her interest, and taken the time to create this space for her. "It is wonderful," she said, turning to face him with tears in her eyes. "You are wonderful. How did I get so lucky?" Zachary crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. "I am the lucky one," he said firmly. "You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know I needed. I love you, Marlowe Xanders, more today than the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." She kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into that kiss. After 5 years of marriage, the passion between them had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered by the trials they had faced together and the life they had built. As they stood in the workshop with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, Marlowe reflected on how far they had come from that terrible day when she learned her brother had sold her to pay his gambling debts. What had seemed like the end of her world had instead been the beginning of something better than she could have imagined. Zachary had not just saved her. He had given her a partnership built on mutual respect, a love that sustained her through hard times, and a family that filled her heart with joy. She had repaid his $8,000 sacrifice not with money, but with her whole heart, and she knew he considered it the best bargain he had ever made. Over the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow and prosper. John grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the cattle and wanted nothing more than to learn everything his father could teach him about ranching. Margaret Rose, by contrast, was wild and adventurous, always climbing trees and racing her pony across the desert at breakneck speeds. Marlowe saw herself in her daughter's fierce independence and made sure Margaret Rose knew she could be anything she wanted to be. When John was 8 and Margaret Rose was 5, Marlowe gave birth to twin boys, much to everyone's surprise. They named them Samuel and Daniel, and the two were inseparable from birth, finishing each other's sentences and getting into twice as much trouble as a single child ever could. Thomas left the ranch when the twins were about 6 months old. He came to Marlowe one morning and said simply that he was heading to San Francisco to start over. She noticed he looked older than his years, worn down by guilt and regret. Part of her wanted to refuse him the money for his journey, to make him face the consequences of his actions. But a larger part remembered that he was still her brother, despite everything, and she gave him enough cash to get established in the city. "I am sorry," Thomas said as he prepared to leave, "for everything I put you through. You deserved better than a brother like me." "Yes, I did," Marlowe agreed, not sugarcoating the truth. "But I forgive you, Thomas, not for your sake but for mine. I refuse to carry anger and resentment into my future." Thomas nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Take care of yourself, Marlowe. And tell Zachary I said he is a better man than I will ever be." She watched him ride away toward Calico, and though she felt a pang of sadness for the brother she might have had, she also felt relief. His presence had been a shadow over the ranch, a constant reminder of betrayal. With him gone, she could finally move forward completely. Zachary found her standing in the yard, watching the dust from Thomas's departure settle. "Are you all right?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "I am more than all right," Marlowe said, leaning into his warmth. "I am happy. Truly, deeply happy." And she was. Despite all the hardships of ranch life, despite the brutal desert heat and the occasional drought and the constant work, Marlowe would not have traded her life for anything. She had a husband who loved her completely, 4 beautiful children who filled her days with laughter, and a home she had helped build with her own 2 hands. As the years passed, Marlowe watched her children grow into capable young adults. John took over more and more of the ranch management, proving to have his father's steady temperament and his mother's head for business. Margaret Rose, true to her independent spirit, announced at 16 that she wanted to become a teacher and began studying with the schoolmarm in Calico. The twins, now energetic 12-year-olds, kept everyone on their toes with their pranks and schemes. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Zachary and Marlowe stood on the same porch where they had first admitted their feelings for each other all those years ago. The ranch had changed dramatically in 2 decades. What had once been a struggling operation was now one of the most successful cattle ranches in San Bernardino County. They employed 10 hands, ran a herd of over 500 head, and owned several additional parcels of land they had purchased over the years. But more importantly, they had built a family and a life filled with love. Their children were healthy and happy, their marriage was strong, and they still looked at each other with the same warmth and affection they had felt in those early days of courtship. "You ever regret it?" Marlowe asked quietly, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. "Spending all your money to save me. You could have used that $8,000 to build something just for yourself." Zachary pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her from behind. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "That money bought me the only thing that really matters in this life: love. You, our children, this family we have built together. I would pay $8,000 100 times over for what we have." Marlowe turned in his arms to face him, seeing the truth of his words written plainly on his face. The years had added some silver to his dark hair and lines around his eyes, but to her, he was as handsome as the day he walked into that saloon to save her. "I love you," she said simply. "More than words can express. You are my hero, Zachary Xanders. You always will be." He kissed her then, a kiss full of passion and promise and the deep contentment that comes from 20 years of partnership. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, their children's voices calling to each other in the distance, cattle lowing in the pastures, horses whinnying in the corrals. It was the sound of home, of family, of everything they had built together. Years continued to pass in contentment and prosperity. Marlowe expanded her leatherworking business, and her saddles became sought after throughout California for their quality and craftsmanship. Zachary served on the town council in Calico, helping to guide the community through the transition as the silver mines began to play out and people looked for new sources of income. John married a sweet young woman from a neighboring ranch when he was 22, and they gave Marlowe and Zachary their first grandchildren, twin girls named Emma and Elizabeth. Margaret Rose achieved her dream of becoming a teacher and opened a school in Calico that served children from all the surrounding ranches. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, surprised everyone by becoming deputy sheriffs, dedicated to keeping the peace in a region that was slowly becoming more settled and civilized. When Marlowe turned 50, Zachary threw her a grand birthday party, inviting everyone they knew. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, bringing food and gifts and stories about the impact Marlowe had made on their lives. Many of the women mentioned how Marlowe's refusal to be cowed by men like Victor Harding had inspired them to stand up for themselves in their own lives. Victor Harding himself had died years earlier, his gambling empire crumbling after the silver boom ended and most of the miners left Calico. No one mourned his passing. As Marlowe stood in the yard of their ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and the community she had helped build, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. The young woman who had stood in a dingy saloon, facing a terrible fate, would never have imagined this future. But that young woman had been saved by a cowboy with a good heart, and together they had created something beautiful. Zachary found her in the crowd and made his way to her side, moving with the slight stiffness of age but still strong and vital. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing her knuckles in that old-fashioned gesture that never failed to make her smile. "Happy birthday, my love," he said. "Thank you for giving me 50 years of happiness." "We have only been married 22 years, Marlowe pointed out with a laugh. "I am counting from the day I first met you, when you were 18, and I was that shy boy hiding in your father's barn," Zachary said. "Even then, I thought you were the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. I just never dreamed I would be lucky enough to make you my wife." Marlowe felt tears sting her eyes, moved by his words and by the life they had shared. "The luck was all mine," she said softly. "You saved me, Zachary, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "You gave my life meaning and purpose. You made me want to be a better man. Everything good in my life comes from loving you." They stood together as the sun set over the desert, watching their family laugh and celebrate around them. Their children were grown and thriving, their grandchildren healthy and happy, and their love as strong as ever. It was everything Marlowe had hoped for and more. In the years that followed, Marlowe and Zachary gradually stepped back from the day-to-day management of the ranch, letting John take over while they enjoyed a well-earned rest. They spent their days in quiet contentment, working together in the workshop, riding out to check on the herd, and spoiling their growing number of grandchildren. Margaret Rose eventually married a young lawyer and moved to Sacramento, though she visited often with her children. Samuel and Daniel both married and continued their work in law enforcement, earning reputations as fair but firm lawmen. The ranch continued to prosper under John's management, adapting to the changing times while maintaining the values his parents had instilled. On their 30th anniversary, Marlowe and Zachary sat on their porch as they had so many times before, watching the stars wheel overhead. They were both in their 50s now, their hair mostly gray and their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work. But they still held hands like young lovers, still found comfort and joy in each other's presence. "If you could go back and change anything," Marlowe asked, "would you?" Zachary was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Maybe I would have found a way to help your father before he died," he said finally. "So you would not have had to endure Thomas's betrayal, but otherwise. No, every hardship we faced made us stronger. Every challenge brought us closer together. I would not trade a single moment of our life together, good or bad." Marlowe nodded, feeling the same way. "I used to have nightmares about what would have happened if you had not walked into that saloon," she admitted. "But now I trust that somehow, some way we would have found each other. Some things are just meant to be." "We are meant to be," Zachary agreed. "Always have been, always will be." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the desert and watching the moon rise over the hills. Inside the house, they could hear their children and grandchildren settling in for the night, the ranch filled with the warmth and noise of family. It was everything they had ever dreamed of and more. As Marlowe grew older, she often thought about that desperate day when her brother had tried to sell her to Victor Harding. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to someone else entirely. The terrified young woman facing an impossible situation had transformed into a confident matriarch surrounded by love and respect. And it was all because of one cowboy's selfless act of courage. Zachary had paid her brother's debt and freed her, asking nothing in return except the chance to build a life together. It was the best investment either of them had ever made. Years continued to pass in contentment. Zachary and Marlowe celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and even 3 great-grandchildren. The ranch had been in the family for over 45 years now, a legacy that would continue for generations to come. They both lived long, healthy lives, still working the ranch into their 70s, though at a much slower pace than their youth. They were respected throughout the region as pioneers who had helped build California into a thriving state. But to their family, they were simply grandma and grandpa, the loving foundation on which everything else was built. On a warm spring evening, when Marlowe was 75 and Zachary 78, they sat on their porch for what would be one of their last times together. Zachary had been feeling poorly for several weeks, and though he tried to hide it, Marlowe could see the fatigue in his eyes. "I am tired, my love," he admitted quietly, taking her hand. "I do not think I have much time left." Marlowe felt her heart break, even though she had known this day would eventually come. "Do not say that," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I am not ready to lose you." "You will never lose me," Zachary said, reaching up to cup her weathered cheek. "I will always be with you, Marlowe. In every sunset we watch together, in every grandchild's smile, in every corner of this ranch we built together. I am part of you just as you are part of me." "I love you," Marlowe said, the words inadequate but all she had. "I have loved you since the day you walked into that saloon to save me, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Zachary replied. "You are my everything. You always have been." He passed away peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by his family with Marlowe holding his hand. The entire community mourned the loss of a good man, but none felt it as deeply as Marlowe, who had lost her partner, her best friend, and the love of her life. Marlowe lived for another 5 years after Zachary's death, continuing to work on the ranch in a limited capacity and spending time with her ever-growing family. But everyone could see that part of her had gone with Zachary, and she was simply waiting to be reunited with him. On a cool autumn evening, almost exactly 53 years after Zachary had walked into the Silver Spur Saloon and changed her life forever, Marlowe passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her children found her in the morning, a smile on her face, and they knew she had finally been reunited with the love of her life. They buried her next to Zachary on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land they had built together for eternity. The entire region came to pay their respects to a woman who had been a pioneer, a businesswoman, a teacher, and an inspiration to everyone who knew her. But Marlowe's real legacy was not the successful ranch or the prosperous business or the many lives she had touched. It was the family she and Zachary had created together, a family built on love, respect, and the unshakable belief that one person's selfless act of courage could change everything. Their descendants continued to run the ranch for generations, passing down the story of how their grandmother had been saved from a terrible fate by a cowboy who sacrificed everything for love. It became a family legend, a reminder that true love was not just about passion or romance, but about choosing to stand beside someone through every trial and triumph life brought. The ranch itself remained in the family for over a century, a testament to what Marlowe and Zachary had built together. And though the original buildings eventually gave way to more modern structures, and the cattle were eventually replaced with other ventures, the spirit of that original partnership lived on in every generation. On the hill where Marlowe and Zachary were buried, their headstones stood side by side, weathered by time but still readable. Marlowe's epitaph read, "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she chose courage over fear." Zachary's read, "Beloved husband, father, grandfather. He chose love over everything." And truly, that was the essence of their story. In a time and place where life was hard and choices were often limited, they had both chosen love. Zachary had chosen to sacrifice his fortune to save a woman he barely remembered, and that choice had led to a lifetime of happiness. Marlowe had chosen to trust in that sacrifice, to build a partnership with the man who had freed her, and that choice had given her everything she ever wanted. Their love story became legendary in San Bernardino County, told and retold at family gatherings and community events. It was a reminder that even in the harsh landscape of the Wild West, where violence and cruelty were common, love could still triumph. One cowboy's act of selfless courage had saved a woman from a terrible fate and created a legacy that lasted for generations. And so their story ended as all the best love stories do, with two people who found each other against all odds, built a life together through hard work and dedication, raised a family filled with love, and remained devoted to each other until their final breaths. It was a story of sacrifice and redemption, of courage and hope, and above all, of the transformative power of true love in the end. The $8,000 Zachary Xanders paid to free Marlowe Graham from her brother's gambling debt was the best investment ever made in San Bernardino County. It bought not just one woman's freedom, but a lifetime of happiness, a thriving ranch, a large and loving family, and a love story that would inspire generations to come. And if Zachary could have seen the full extent of what his sacrifice would create, he would have paid double the amount without hesitation, because Marlowe was worth every penny and so much more.